elevating the discussion while talking about the things that matter most. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey everyone, Connor Boyack here along with Brian Hyde for Society and the State, episode number 62, about basically doing nothing. That's what this episode boils down to, because it is the key to avoiding criticism. You know, as the oft-repeated quote goes, do nothing, be nothing, say nothing. I find that there's a lot of so-called snowflakes in the world who, you know, melt at the very thought of controversy or conflict. A lot of people who are passive-aggressive and worried about offending somebody else. And, I don't want to step on their toes. I don't want to make enemies. I don't want to, offend anyone's sensibilities or upset anybody. And, of course, that lack of engagement and dialogue and civil disagreement and discussion, I think, has exacerbated a lot of the problems that we see in society today. People have the inability to diplomatically, conscientiously, and kindly even disagree with one another and take a stand for things that they perceive to be the truth. So that's what we're talking about today, the key to avoiding criticism. And, as someone who has perhaps accumulated a few critics along the way, some of them needlessly, which is important to point out. I have myself gone through a bit of a learning phase where initially when I was getting active and involved and outspoken, I needlessly upset people. I said things the wrong way. I was a little bit too aggressive or, in some cases, perhaps even offensive. I didn't do things the right way. So I've accumulated critics who, there's still old wounds there that we're trying to heal and work through. So there's that aspect to be said for, there's a wrong way to do the right thing. And then there's the right way to do the right thing. Brian, having been on radio for a while, slinging red meat as you did in the past, you have your fair share of critics. What have you learned, looking back in terms of, it's we're always going to have critics if we're being outspoken and doing, shaking things up a little bit. But you've gone through your own, learning curve as well in this. What's the takeaway that you've learned from accumulating critics and trying to stand for truth, but maybe doing it a little bit differently than you did years ago?
There's two things that I've learned. One came immediately, and this is something anyone who has stood for anything knows. You have to develop thick skin. Mm-hmm. If you are averse to people saying mean things about you or dragging your name through the mud, you're probably not ready to make that stand. And it's okay. That's a natural part of human preservation. We want to preserve our ego and our psyche from attack. Mm-hmm. However, if there's something you're going to stand for, you're going to get criticized. Accept it and let your skin thicken. Probably the most important thing I've learned compared to, I think you and I have had a similar experience. It used to be if somebody offered criticism, that was like a call to battle. Mm-hmm. Well, I will rise to the challenge, and on my horse with my lance in hand, I'm ready to go joust with them. When I started to lose the need to win a discussion, that's when I found my effectiveness in communicating, whatever that message was, increased exponentially.
Say that again. When you found that you lost?
When I lost the need to win, that's when people began to listen. Even if they vehemently disagreed, if I wasn't trying to dominate them, they were more likely to listen and at least say, well, I still don't agree with you, but at least I see where you're coming from. Or maybe even sometimes down the road, they would come to me and say, I've had some time to think about this, and I see your point. That's a far cry from, I've beaten them into submission, and right. Now we know who's boss.
Everything you just said reminds me of a meme that perfectly describes me a decade ago. And it's like a political cartoon, and a guy's hunched over the computer. His wife comes in, honey, it's 1 a.m, come to bed. And he says, I can't. There's someone wrong on the internet.
Yep. Yep.
And that used to be me. I had to persuade everyone of the truthfulness of my position. And, I had to use big words to demonstrate my, my vernacular, right? There we go. And I had to show people that they were wrong by not only showing them, but showing everyone else reading and watching, right? I had to kind of flex my muscles and say, everyone, come join my cause because I'm right. And that's not that like all of that is inherently wrong. You can't do any of that or whatever. The point, I really like what you said, right? Losing the need to win, being okay with people being wrong, because then it puts you more in a position of perhaps humility and patience, trying to kind of lead them towards your position rather than shove them or pull them, toward your position. Nevertheless, when you stand for a principle that is unpopular or controversial or unexpected or different or whatever, you are going to upset people, especially those who have a vested interest in the status quo, right? I think, for example, most recently with our work, trying to repeal the mandatory vehicle safety inspection a year ago. And in doing that here in our home state in Utah, we found ourselves lobbying on the other side of a ton of Jiffy Lube employees who were using all sorts of specious and crazy arguments about public safety and, things are going to be horrible, when really it came down to them protecting their bottom line. And, the evil glares that we would get. And, the nasty messages that we would get, right? And the things that were said about us. And, you're going to kill people. The blood's going to be on your hands, And so you do something that you feel is right, that you feel you have the data on your side or whatever, and you're going to get critics who not only come after your arguments, but again, one of the key logical fallacies is that when people cannot articulate an argument to try and address or rebut yours, they try and go after the messenger rather than the message. And so inevitably, when you're standing for truth, people are going to come after you. Brian, you've taken a number of controversial stands over the years. You've articulated arguments that among your audience was perhaps outside the straight and narrow, as you will. How have you dealt with people trying to attack you rather than attacking or trying to address your message?
First of all, don't take it personal. And secondly, you have to understand, and we've all been guilty of this at some level, when we encounter information that contradicts what we think is true or what we believe to be true or what we've always known to be true, we want to defend ourselves. We want to protect our little mental universes from contradictions. So for someone to push back, totally natural and normal, and you have to understand that and not take it personally. Having said that, you also need to be willing, I think when you're taking a stand, there are certain questions that you want to ask yourself. Is there anything that I believe in so strongly that I would be willing to put my reputation on the line for it? Maybe my job or, my standing in the community. But it's something I believe deeply enough that I would be willing to basically part with polite society in order to stand for it. And, that's the kind of thing that takes some introspection. People who are likely to have made a stance like that, typically they're not going to be doing it for a self-serving motive. Self-serving would be all about, I'm bringing attention to me and whatever the issue is, it's me. If it's really something, a principle or an ideal that you uphold and you're willing to suffer for it, that's a good indication to know what you stand for. And you just have to accept the fact that the criticism is going to come with it. But the criticism is actually a compliment in the sense that people who are not having impact, people who are not making waves are not going to be noticed. So if you have no criticism, chances are you're either not reaching enough people or you're not trying hard enough.
Just going with the flow.
Yep.
There's such an important point I want to introduce here too that relates to some of our discussions on civil disobedience. In the past, we've talked about how it's much easier to stand up for something, to disobey an unjust law when it's only you. But when you have commitments, when you get married, when you have kids, when you're the breadwinner and you have to go home to continue feeding your kids and so forth, it becomes much harder to take a stand up for something because the consequences touch so many more people who didn't sign up for the same fight, may even disagree with you. Perhaps, you and your wife, disagree, for example, you and your spouse. And so I got to say here that when we're talking about taking a stand that brings criticism, especially when that criticism becomes personal, I think it becomes much harder when your spouse is sitting there, watch all of it happen. Even if they're not affected, even if they agree with you, they love you, they support you, and then they see you getting attacked and they feel that too. Right. And so it becomes much harder to go out and, quote, make enemies, or rather do what you think is right, which will inevitably invite and attract criticism when you've got other people there on your team who, don't want to see you go through that. And of course, this happens with typically anyone running for political office who has a challenger and people trying to attack them and all sorts of mudslinging. And so it's part and parcel, unfortunately, of the system that we live in. But it is an important consideration because, yes, you have to develop thick skin, Brian, as you said. I totally agree with that. but you also have to find a way perhaps to thicken the skin of those around you. And I'm not quite sure, the best way to do that or recommend that. I think that's a challenge to ponder on.
It is tough, and you're right. There is some collateral effect on the people who love you the most. I had someone wrote a very, very seriously pointed attack against me a few years ago, and I mean it was harsh. It's probably the harshest one I've ever had done to date. And I asked my wife at one point. I said, "Hey, would you read this?" And I really wished I hadn't asked her to read it because it upset her. It upset her way more than it upset me.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, I got to be careful.
And part of it, I think, is, the criticisms I get, I don't pass those on to, in my case, my wife, right? I don't like, hey, honey, here, look at all these tweets and look at this nasty Facebook message that I get. And so maybe you try and insulate them from seeing that. If you get too public, then the criticisms get much more public than a Facebook thread or whatever. And so then perhaps you can't really shield the person. I think that's why you need to have a conviction of the truthfulness of your cause. Right? If you think of this, for those of you who are religious in a religious sense, maybe you've been a missionary for your church before, inevitably that's going to attract opposition. And yet you believe that you are right. And so you factor that in to the equation. You just say, look, that's part of speaking out. That's part of me having my faith. And I think so too with political principles, economic principles, whatever, social principles. When you take a stand for something you believe is right, there will be people who disagree. Now, one of the interesting strategies, Brian, you and I were talking about this before. You have an article I think that you want to mention is in the political sense, it's called punching down. You never want to punch down. So if let's say I'm the incumbent and I'm running for political office again, and I'm being challenged by someone who has very low likelihood of winning, right? But he's the challenger. He's going to do everything he can to try and get me to engage him, right? Because he wants me to legitimize his candidacy. So he's going to attack me. He's going to point out all my defects. He's going to, try and nip at my heels. And in the political world, any good consultant is going to tell their candidate, don't punch down. Don't address them. Don't debate them. Don't talk to them, right? When I was on Senator Mike Lee's campaign, we dealt with this with Bob Bennett. He was not punching down. He would not debate. He would not engage until at the very end he had to because the polls started showing that he was losing. Suddenly he was punching up because the table was starting to turn. And yet early on, we were nipping at his heels. We were trying to get his attention. We were trying to get him to respond because we wanted to be in the ring with him and not the other challengers. We wanted to be the part of the boxing match. And so I think when you're taking a stand for something, Brian, maybe this gets to your point about not always needing to prove other people wrong or, win an argument. Not punching down is, look, if you believe you're right about something, don't feel that you need to go in and address and rebut every concern or criticism that someone raises. In fact, what I found beauty in kind of having a following now on Facebook is letting other people do it for me. I can post something, I can take a stand, I can say something perhaps controversial or whatever, and other people will engage in the discussion so it's not just me, right? It's not me cramming stuff down people's throats. It's me saying, hey, consider this or let's talk about this. And then we can foster dialogue rather than Connor Boyack shoving it down everybody's throats. Brian, I think this article, I want you to bring this up because I read this last night. It was really interesting, and it contains some other nuggets of wisdom as we're talking about criticism and how you respond to these things. So why don't you maybe set up the article?
Okay, the article was published on The Art of Manliness, which if you haven't checked out theartofmanliness.com or artofmanliness.com, it's a very worthwhile website. Lots of great tips for better living. This one is talking about never complain, never explain, which was a quote from the British politician Benjamin Disraeli. And the idea here is simply this. If you have the convictions of your beliefs, like you're talking about, Connor, you don't need to explain yourself to people who don't have either your respect or, for that matter, aren't offering anything in way of a constructive criticism. Now, look, there are people that you know, and there are people I know that if they pulled me aside and said, Brian, I have to tell you, I think you're wrong on this issue. If it's somebody I respect, you better believe I'm going to listen. And I'm going to be grateful that they care enough to risk hurting my feelings by telling me, I think you're wrong about this. Mm-hmm. If it's just some anonymous troll, out there, sowing seeds of discord on the internet, I don't really have any connection there. What they think of me is really none of my business. And like you were saying earlier, this article points out you only give them authority when you deign to respond to it. So if you If you don't want to give authority or draw attention to their critique, just keep putting the message out. That you focus on the message and less on trying to win the approval of someone who's probably never going to give it to you in the first place.
This also ties into past conversations we've had where in our social media world, we're incentivizing the wrong behavior. We're incentivizing superficiality with all the likes and the hearts and the shares and everything else. People are just trying to impress and put on a show for other people that will induce them to like them. And I think it's the same way with these conversations or with these arguments or messages that we're putting out there and trying to advance a cause that we believe in. That with the message, we should be concerned with the substance, the core truth, the message that we believe is right. But if we're focused on not offending people, if we're focused on wording it the right way to tiptoe around everybody so everyone loves me and makes me happy, we're going to lose that core substance. I think we water it down. You can still do it lovingly and diplomatically or whatever. But look, at the end of the day, there are going to be people who disagree. Let's at least frame the message we believe in a way that's respectful, but still take a stand for the things we believe is true. Brian, I hadn't planned on talking about this, but a thought that just entered my mind. I wonder if part of the problem in avoiding criticism and controversy is people feeling unsure of themselves in their message that they believe in. So certainly I think in a religious context, perhaps if someone is a Christian, but they don't read the Bible very well, they couldn't really defend themselves well in an argument, right? If, say, an atheist or whatever, a former believer stands up and tries to undermine the Bible, they would not feel competent enough, and so they never try and enter the fray. They never try and take a stand because they're worried about being challenged and being ill-equipped to defend their beliefs. In a political or economic context, I think the same thing is true. A lot of people may, on the surface, identify as conservative, libertarian, whatever, but if challenged, could they explain the underlying axioms and principles and theories and ideas that are at the root of their supposed belief? And so this kind of broadens the conversation into society's decline of reading books and having these conversations and understanding, where someone watches, Glenn Beck or Fox News or whatever and says, oh, I'm a conservative. But again, when challenged, they would wilt like a decaying flower. And so they disengage and they don't enter the fray because they're worried about being challenged. Do you think that there's legitimacy in that? Do you think that's part of the problem?
Oh, yeah. People who are uncertain are the ones who tend to be the most dogmatic about what they believe. People who do study a lot, they may be firm in their belief, but they also they typically have at least some concept of the idea that I don't have all the answers. And they'll preface what they say with, in my opinion, or it appears, according to what we know, they'll qualify what they're saying, which that's not, creating loopholes that they can always, walk it back if they have to, but they're just acknowledging that I don't have all of the answers, but according to what I do understand, this is how I see it. And if the thing I think that we sometimes forget, if you have fought to understand something, for instance, to really come to an understanding of what your principles are, if you have given the time and effort to know what they are, you've won the hardest battle. It was the one with yourself. It was the one with your own limitations
I like that.
Recognizing that you needed some improvement. So you don't need the approval of others, once you have won that battle. Everybody somewhere on that path of, trying to fight their way out of disinformation and lack of knowledge, we have to be gentle with them. But we also have to understand that, it's our duty to help others along as they want to be helped along. We're not moving them with a cattle prod.
That's such a good point, because it's one that I learned only after several years of engaging in the public, and that was that everyone's on a spectrum. I can't expect everyone to be on the same, not only on the same path that I'm following in terms of a pursuit of a certain belief or idea, but also at the same point on that path, right? And so some people had never read the books I have. And so, hey, maybe I'll start them on this one, and then let's talk about it, and then read this next one and lead them along. But when I came to realize and really internalize the fact that everyone's at a different place in life, everyone has been exposed to different ideas and things, I became a lot more forgiving and patient in terms of how I communicated with people, recognizing that, look, most of these people have never read the books I've read. They've never encountered these ideas. And so let's start to kind of introduce them into that funnel. Let's start to bring them down slowly along the path in this direction by inviting them, by engaging them, by, putting things out there that, yes, some critics will jump in on and pick apart and criticize, but at least pique their curiosity so that when they see, that I believe in this, that I'm a man of conviction, that I, act according to my beliefs, that's going to intrigue them enough to kind of start following that path that I can then lead them along, recognizing that maybe I will always be ahead of them on that path because I kind of had a head start, right? Or whatever. And that's fine. But a long time ago, it was, no, you have to believe the things that I believe. You need to understand this right now. I'm going to cram it down your throats. And that's not effective. And I think it undermines us because that becomes very easy to criticize, right? It's people are, when a critic sees that everyone else in the conversation does not understand the same things at the same depth that I do or whoever, I think it's easier for them to try and pull those people away. I don't know. It's an interesting thought.
Yeah. One thing that I have learned to accept is that criticism, while it can sting, does not fundamentally change who you are. And if you look at it the right way, it can be a very validating thing that, hey, somebody noticed what you're doing. Chris Jami, I hope I'm saying his name right. It's Jami. I think he's a poet, but he's had a couple of different observations on criticism. I'm going to share two quick ones here with you. He says the motive behind criticism often determines its validity. Those who care criticize where necessary. Those who envy criticize the moment they think they found a weak spot. So that's not only for when we're being criticized, but that's a good gut check for when we're tempted to criticize someone.
Yeah.
And I loved this one. He says there are also those who inadvertently grant power to another man's words by continuously trying to spite him. If a man gets to the point where he can simply say, the sky is blue, and people indignantly rush up to him to refute him, saying, no, the sky is light blue, whether they realize it or not, he has become an authority figure even to such adversaries.
It's kind of the quote, like any news is good news in a sense. I remember when we published the latest Tuttle Twins book based on Atlas Shrugged, and we had Salon, which is like the online progressive website, and some of these other folks like gang piling on, oh, this is horrible, they're indoctrinating kids, and Ayn Rand for children is like the worst thing for society ever.
A new generation of objectivists.
Exactly. Selfish children are selfish enough. They don't need to be taught the virtue of selfishness. And frankly, from a marketing perspective, I welcomed that because I knew the criticism was insubstantial, it was superficial, it was easily rebutted, but it attracted people's attention, right? And so in a way, criticism can be good because it allows for debate. It allows for you to better articulate your ideas. Think of the presidential stage. I remember back when Ron Paul was running, and he would stand for truth. He would articulate an idea that ran against what everyone else on the stage believed. But the fact that he did it got Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney and others to kind of gang tackle him, which allowed him more time to respond, right, with kind of the debate logistics. Hey, you were mentioned. You get another 30 seconds. Fantastic. Here we go. I'm going to continue to expound the truth. And so that criticism can be leveraged in a way to say, well, look, here's, someone else articulating a different idea. Now let me respond. And the mere fact that there is disagreement and engagement allows a platform. It attracts people's attention. It focuses them on the idea so that they can begin discerning, wait, who do I believe with? Or who do I side with? Who do I believe? And so I think it can actually be good in a way if you leverage it the right way. Certainly criticism can get nasty, but I think as long as you are studious, you are sure of your conviction, you've thought it through, you've been, challenged and refined and poked at or whatever, then don't fear criticism. Because to your point, Brian, earlier, friends and people who care about you will criticize you in the right way, will give you that feedback, will oppose things that you do. That will help you. That will make you better, right? And then you'll have all the, random other critics who you can either ignore, you don't punch down, or you can spin it around and leverage it to, amplify your voice and spread your convictions even further.
I know for a fact that by taking that road of losing the need to win, even when people come out swinging, you just take the hits and smile and keep on moving forward. Those are the times where people have come back to me at some later point and said, I feel that I've misjudged you. And in further, in retrospect, I'm looking at where I was criticizing you and I think I was unfounded. And that's an awesome thing because now you not only have gained someone who, sees validity in what you're saying, but
right.
You've potentially created a friend and, it's a great way to magnify your influence. And it's much more effective than, I left him curled up, sucking his thumb, in the fetal position.
And speaking of much more effective, in the cases where I've had that, where I've had former critics turned fans and co-believers, those people become some of the most powerful evangelists because they can go to their former cohorts, right? The people that, they used to agree with, the people who continue to criticize you and say, look, I used to believe like you. I used to be the same way, but, Brian pointed out this thing and it got me thinking, and here's what changed for me. And the fact that that person can empathize with and relate to that audience and show their own progress in going from there to you invites and encourages people far better than you continuing to plant your flag and sow your seed and declare your territory, right? And so if we approach it the right way and bring those people along, they're some of the most effective missionaries to go out to other people and continue to grow your audience and expand your message. And so you don't want to discount those people. You don't want to offend those people. You want to take a stand. You want to argue what you believe, but you want to do it patiently, lovingly, diplomatically, so that you turn even your worst critics into your best fans over time.
It sounds trite, but the fact is love will open more doors than not.
I like it. Well, for those of you who have read Feardom, that's kind of the thing at the end. In fact, I'll mention in closing, my kids just watched it the other day, Monsters, Inc., right? They had the entire alien monster world running on fear and screams, and it was at the end, for those of you who've seen the movie, where they recognized that love and laughter could be a much more sustainable energy source. And I think so too with our engagement, taking a stand. If we do it the right way, we're going to have better long-term results. We're going to have greater affinity with the people who are with us. We're going to have more internal satisfaction, I think, too, because it is hard taking a stand. It is exhausting, and it is tough to stand alone sometimes. So, guys, you need critics. If you don't have them, go have a little gut check. Maybe you got to read a few books. Maybe you got to start speaking out, because we want to change the world. You want to do good things. You're going to have critics. But, Brian, we're going to link to this article that you found on today's show notes page, societyandthestate.com/62. All right, guys, we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks for joining us on Society and the State.
You've been listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.